What happens when a man who's spent his life tearing down faith meets a young mind who's ready to defend it? This isn't just a story about a debate. It's about what happens when arrogance collides with quiet conviction. And trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how this unfolds. The grand lecture hall at the annual Academic Horizons Conference was a sight to behold. Rows of polished wooden desks stretched out beneath a vaulted ceiling adorned with intricate carvings of historical figures in science and philosophy. The air buzzed with the energy of young scholars and seasoned academics, all gathered to exchange ideas and challenge one another's perspectives. It was a place where intellect reigned supreme, and reputations were made or unmade. Among the attendees was 19-year-old Barron Trump, a freshman at a prestigious university. Despite his youth, Barron had earned his place at the conference through his academic achievements, particularly in the fields of history and philosophy. Yet whispers followed him wherever he went. Some attendees speculated that his last name had opened doors for him, while others dismissed him outright as a product of privilege. Barron, however, was used to such assumptions. He had resolved long ago to let his work and conduct speak for themselves. Sitting near the back of the hall, Barron adjusted his tie and opened his notebook, ready to take notes on the day's keynote lecture. The speaker was none other than Dr. Charles Whitman, a renowned cognitive scientist and one of the most celebrated thinkers in his field. Dr. Whitman was known for his sharp intellect, his groundbreaking research on human cognition, and his unapologetic critiques of traditional beliefs. His lectures were legendary, not just for their content, but for the way he wielded his wit like a scalpel, cutting through what he saw as outdated ideas with precision and flair. As the room filled, Barron noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Conversations quieted, and all eyes turned toward the stage as Dr. Whitman entered. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and a commanding presence. Dressed in a tailored suit, he exuded confidence as he approached the podium, his movements deliberate and assured. The room seemed to hold its breath as he adjusted the microphone and surveyed the audience. "Good morning, everyone," Dr. Whitman began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "It's a pleasure to be here at the Academic Horizons Conference, where the brightest minds of today gather to shape the ideas of tomorrow." A polite round of applause followed, but Dr. Whitman didn't wait for it to subside before continuing. "Today, I want to talk about something that has fascinated and frustrated me throughout my career: the persistence of antiquated beliefs in an age of reason." Barron's pen hovered over his notebook as he listened intently. He had read some of Dr. Whitman's work and knew that the professor often used his platform to challenge religious and traditional worldviews. While Barron respected the professor's intellect, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. He had seen how Dr. Whitman's lectures often turned into performances, where dissenting views were not just debated, but dismantled with a kind of theatrical ruthlessness. Dr. Whitman began pacing the stage, his hands clasped behind his back. "We live in an era of unprecedented scientific discovery," he said. "We've mapped the human genome, explored the far reaches of space, and unlocked the mysteries of quantum mechanics. And yet, despite all this progress, there are still those who cling to beliefs that belong to the Dark Ages." A few chuckles rippled through the audience, and Dr. Whitman smiled, clearly enjoying the reaction. "Now, don't get me wrong," he continued. "I understand the appeal of tradition. It's comforting. It provides a sense of stability in an uncertain world. But let's be honest. Tradition is often just a polite word for inertia. It's the refusal to move forward, to adapt, to evolve." Barron's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. He had heard arguments like this before, and while he didn't agree with them, he knew better than to react impulsively. Instead, he focused on taking notes, jotting down the professor's key points. Dr. Whitman's tone shifted, becoming more pointed. Let's address the elephant in the room, he said, stopping in the center of the stage. Studies consistently show an inverse correlation between intelligence and religious belief. In simpler terms, the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in supernatural fantasies. The room grew quieter. Some students exchanged uneasy glances, while others nodded in agreement. Dr. Whitman pulled up a graph on the screen behind him, showing a declining line that he claimed represented the relationship between education levels and religious adherence. "See this?" he said, gesturing to the graph. "This is what happens when people are exposed to knowledge and critical thinking. Religious belief declines. It's a natural progression, one that we should celebrate, not resist." Barron's pen paused mid-sentence. He could feel the professor's gaze sweeping the room, searching for a reaction. When their eyes briefly met, Barron saw a flicker of recognition in Dr. Whitman's expression. The professor's lips curled into a faint smirk, as if he had just spotted an opportunity. "Of course," Dr. Whitman continued, his tone now tinged with sarcasm, "there are always exceptions. Some people hold on to their beliefs no matter how much evidence is presented to the contrary. Family traditions, cultural pressures, these things can be hard to overcome." The professor's eyes lingered on Barron for a moment longer than necessary, and the implication was clear. A few students glanced in Barron's direction, their curiosity piqued. Barron remained composed, his face betraying no emotion. But inside, he felt a spark of determination. If Dr. Whitman was trying to provoke him, he wouldn't take the bait, at least not yet. Dr. Whitman resumed his pacing, his voice growing more animated. "You know what I find truly remarkable?" he said. "In this room, we have some of the brightest young minds in America, future scientists, leaders, thinkers, and yet, I guarantee some of you still cling to these primitive beliefs, unable to break free from your cognitive limitations." The tension in the room was palpable. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, eager to see where this was going. Barron sat perfectly still, his pen resting on his notebook. He knew the professor's words were meant to provoke, but he also knew that reacting impulsively would only play into Dr. Whitman's hands. "Tell me," Dr. Whitman said, removing his glasses and leaning forward on the podium, "what does it say about someone's intellectual capacity when they still believe in an invisible sky daddy in 2025? When their cognitive development is so stunted that they need fairy tales to explain the world?" A few nervous chuckles broke the silence, but most of the audience remained quiet, sensing the tension in the air. Dr. Whitman's gaze swept the room once more, finally settling on Barron. "Perhaps," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "one of our more politically connected students would care to enlighten us." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. All eyes turned to Barron, who sat motionless for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly and deliberately, he closed his notebook, placed his pen on the desk, and stood. "Actually, Professor," Barron said, his voice calm and measured, "I would be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." The room fell silent. Dr. Whitman raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Well, well," he said, a smirk spreading across his face. "Young Mr. Trump wants to educate us about intellectual capacity. Please, enlighten us." Barron took a deep breath, his mind racing as he prepared to respond. He knew this was no ordinary classroom discussion. This was a test, not just of his knowledge, but of his composure, his character, and his ability to stand firm in the face of ridicule. And he was ready. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the projector. All eyes were on Barron as he stood, his posture calm and composed. He adjusted his tie slightly, a small gesture that seemed to signal he was ready for what was to come. "First," Barron began, his voice steady and respectful, "I find it interesting that someone who champions intellectual discourse would resort to mockery instead of engaging in a genuine exchange of ideas." A murmur rippled through the audience. Dr. Whitman's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered, leaning casually against the podium. "Oh, please," the professor said, waving a hand dismissively. "Spare us the platitudes. If you have something to say, Mr. Trump, say it. We're all ears." Barron nodded, unfazed. "Thank you, Professor. Since you've invited me to speak, I'd like to address your claim that religious belief is incompatible with intelligence. You've presented a graph showing a correlation between education levels and declining religious adherence. But as you know, correlation does not imply causation." Dr. Whitman raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but unwilling to concede the point. "Go on," he said, his tone skeptical. Barron continued, his voice gaining strength. "You argue that as people become more educated, they abandon faith. But you've ignored the countless brilliant minds throughout history, and even today, who have reconciled faith and reason. Isaac Newton, Max Planck, Francis Collins. These are just a few examples of individuals who contributed immensely to science while maintaining a belief in God." The professor chuckled, shaking his head. "Ah, the old appeal to authority. Newton and Planck lived in a time when religion was the default worldview. They didn't know any better. As for Collins, well, even brilliant people can hold irrational beliefs." Barron smiled slightly, undeterred. "Respectfully, Professor, dismissing their faith as a product of ignorance or irrationality seems unscientific. After all, isn't the essence of science to follow the evidence wherever it leads, without bias?" The room was captivated. Students who had initially sided with Dr. Whitman were now leaning forward in their seats, eager to hear more. Even Professor Thompson, seated near the back, couldn't help but nod in quiet approval. Dr. Whitman straightened, his expression hardening. "Fine," he said. "Let's talk about evidence. Science has explained everything that religion once claimed was divine intervention. Lightning, disease, the origins of the universe, these were all mysteries that people attributed to God. But now we know better. We don't need a sky daddy to explain the world." Barron's expression remained calm. "You're right, Professor. Science has explained many things that were once mysteries. But there are still questions that science cannot answer. Questions about meaning, purpose, and morality. For example, why does the universe exist at all? Why are the physical constants of the universe so finely tuned for life? And what is the origin of consciousness?" Dr. Whitman opened his mouth to respond, but Barron pressed on. "You might argue that these are just gaps in our current knowledge, and that science will eventually provide answers. But isn't that itself a form of faith? A belief that science will one day explain everything, even though it hasn't yet?" The professor's jaw tightened. "That's not faith," he said sharply. "That's confidence in the scientific method." "Confidence," Barron repeated, his tone thoughtful. "Or perhaps an assumption. After all, the scientific method is a tool for understanding the natural world. It's not equipped to answer metaphysical questions. To claim that science will one day explain everything is to step outside the bounds of science and into the realm of philosophy." The audience was riveted. Even those who had initially dismissed Barron as a privileged teenager were now listening intently, impressed by his poise and reasoning. Dr. Whitman's face reddened slightly, but he refused to back down. "Let me ask you this, Mr. Trump," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you believe in miracles? Do you believe that God intervenes in the world, defying the laws of nature?" Barron paused for a moment, considering his response. "I believe," he said carefully, "that the laws of nature themselves are evidence of a creator. The fact that the universe operates according to consistent, intelligible principles suggests design, not randomness. As for miracles, I think it's possible that God, as the author of those laws, could choose to act within or beyond them. But that's not the central question here. "Oh?" Dr. Whitman said, crossing his arms. "And what is the central question, in your view?" "The central question," Barron replied, meeting the professor's gaze, "is whether it's more intellectually honest to admit that there might be realities beyond our current understanding, or to insist that everything must fit within the framework of materialism." The room was silent. Dr. Whitman's confident demeanor was beginning to crack, and the audience could sense it. For the first time, the professor seemed unsure of how to respond. Professor Thompson, watching from the back, leaned forward in his seat. He had seen Dr. Whitman dominate countless debates, but this was different. Barron wasn't just holding his own. He was challenging the professor in a way that few had dared to before. Dr. Whitman cleared his throat, his voice tinged with frustration. "You're very good at dodging the question, Mr. Trump. But let's get back to the issue at hand. You claim that faith and reason can coexist. Prove it." Barron smiled faintly. "I don't think it's my job to prove that faith and reason can coexist, Professor. History has already done that. The real question is why you're so determined to deny it." The tension in the room was electric. Dr. Whitman's face flushed, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. The audience held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "What do you think? Is faith just a crutch, or does it offer answers that science cannot? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button." Dr. Whitman's fingers gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles whitening as he leaned forward. His usual air of unshakable confidence was beginning to waver, but he wasn't ready to concede. Not yet. "Let me make this simple for you, Mr. Trump," he said, his voice sharp. "Faith is a crutch. It's what people turn to when they can't handle the complexities of reality. Science, on the other hand, is about evidence, reason, and progress. Faith is about clinging to outdated myths. So tell me, what exactly does faith offer that science cannot?" Barron took a moment before responding, his expression thoughtful. "Faith," he said slowly, "offers something that science, for all its brilliance, cannot meaning. Science can tell us how the universe works, but it can't tell us why it exists in the first place. It can describe the mechanisms of life, but it can't explain the purpose of life. Faith addresses the questions that science isn't equipped to answer." Dr. Whitman scoffed. "Meaning? Purpose? Those are subjective constructs. They're not real. They're just stories we tell ourselves to feel better about our existence." Barron tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "If meaning and purpose are just stories, then why do we crave them so deeply? Why do we, as humans, seek something greater than ourselves? Even you, Professor, have dedicated your life to the pursuit of knowledge. Isn't that, in itself, a search for meaning?" The professor opened his mouth to respond, but Barron continued, his voice gaining strength. "You see, Professor, the very fact that we long for meaning suggests that it's not just a construct. It's a fundamental part of who we are. And faith provides a framework for understanding that longing. It gives us a sense of connection to something greater, something eternal." The room was utterly silent. Even the students who had initially laughed at Dr. Whitman's jabs were now listening intently, their expressions thoughtful. Professor Thompson, seated near the back, couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for the young man standing before them. Barron wasn't just holding his own. He was shifting the entire tone of the discussion. Dr. Whitman straightened, his face flushed. "That's all very poetic, Mr. Trump. But poetry doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Let's talk about facts. You mentioned earlier that the universe is finely tuned for life. That's a common argument among theists, but it's based on a flawed premise. The universe isn't fine-tuned for life. Life adapted to the universe. If the conditions had been different, life would have evolved differently, or not at all." Barron nodded, acknowledging the point. "That's a valid argument, Professor. But it doesn't address the deeper question: why are the conditions of the universe so precisely calibrated in the first place? The odds of the physical constants being exactly what they are, allowing for the existence of stars, planets, and life, are astronomically low. It's like flipping a coin 1,000,000,000,000 times and having it land on heads every single time. Doesn't that suggest design rather than chance? Dr. Whitman's lips pressed into a thin line. Or it suggests that we're just one of countless universes, and we happen to exist in the one where the conditions are right. It's not design, it's probability. Barron smiled faintly. The multiverse theory is an interesting idea, but it's not without its own challenges. For one, it's entirely speculative. There's no empirical evidence to support it. And even if it were true, it doesn't eliminate the question of design. It just pushes it back a step. After all, where did the multiverse come from? The professor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The audience, sensing the shift in the debate, began to murmur quietly. Barron's calm, measured responses were dismantling the professor's arguments piece by piece, and it was clear that Dr. Whitman was struggling to regain control. Dr. Whitman took a deep breath, his voice hardening. "You're very good at asking questions, Mr. Trump, but questions don't prove anything. If you're so convinced that faith and reason can coexist, then tell me, how do you reconcile the existence of evil and suffering with the idea of a benevolent God?" A ripple of tension passed through the room. It was a question that had stumped theologians and philosophers for centuries, and Dr. Whitman clearly believed it would be the young man's undoing. Barron's expression grew serious. "That's a difficult question, Professor, and I won't pretend to have all the answers. But I think it's important to remember that the existence of evil and suffering doesn't necessarily disprove the existence of God. In fact, it raises its own set of questions. If there is no God and the universe is purely material, then concepts like good and evil are just social constructs. They have no objective meaning. But if we believe that good and evil are real, that they matter, then we're acknowledging a moral framework that points to something beyond ourselves." Barron shook his head. "I'm not saying the—" Dr. Whitman's eyes narrowed. "So you're saying that suffering is part of some divine plan? That's a convenient excuse." Barron shook his head. "I'm not saying that suffering is good or that it's easy to understand. But I do believe that faith offers hope in the face of suffering. It reminds us that our pain is not meaningless, that there is a greater story being written, and it challenges us to respond to suffering with compassion, courage, and love." The room was silent once more. Dr. Whitman's face was a mixture of frustration and something else, something that looked almost like doubt. For the first time, he seemed to be grappling with the possibility that he might not have all the answers. Professor Thompson leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had seen Dr. Whitman dominate countless debates. But this was different. Barron wasn't just holding his own. He was forcing the professor to confront his own assumptions. Dr. Whitman cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. "You're a very articulate young man, Mr. Trump, but I still don't see how faith can coexist with reason. They're fundamentally opposed." Barron met the professor's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I disagree, Professor. Faith and reason are not enemies. They're allies. Reason helps us understand the world, while faith gives us the courage to face it. Together, they allow us to seek truth, to ask the big questions, and to live with purpose." The audience erupted into applause. Even some of the students who had initially sided with Dr. Whitman were now clapping, their expressions a mixture of admiration and respect. Dr. Whitman stood frozen for a moment, his hands gripping the podium. He looked out at the audience, then back at Barron, his face unreadable. Dr. Whitman stood at the podium, his hands gripping its edges as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The applause from the audience was still echoing through the lecture hall, and for the first time in his career, he seemed unsure of what to say next. His usual confidence, his sharp wit, his ability to dominate any intellectual exchange, all of it seemed to falter in the face of Barron's calm and reasoned arguments. Barron, meanwhile, remained standing, his expression composed but not triumphant. He wasn't here to humiliate the professor or to bask in the approval of the audience. He had spoken his truth, and that was enough. Dr. Whitman finally cleared his throat, his voice quieter than before. "You've given me a lot to think about, Mr. Trump," he said, his tone lacking its earlier condescension. "I may not agree with you, but I can't deny that you've presented your case with intelligence and grace. For that, I commend you." The audience murmured in surprise. It wasn't often that Dr. Whitman offered such an acknowledgment, especially to someone so young. Barron nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Professor. I appreciate the opportunity to engage in this discussion. I believe that true progress comes not from silencing opposing views, but from listening to them." The professor's lips twitched into a faint smile, though his eyes betrayed a hint of weariness. "Perhaps you're right," he said softly. "Perhaps I've been too quick to dismiss perspectives that don't align with my own." The room was silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Even those who had come expecting a one-sided lecture had been drawn into the depth and sincerity of the exchange. It was no longer about winning or losing. It was about the pursuit of truth. Professor Thompson, seated near the back, rose to his feet and began clapping. Slowly, others joined in, until the entire hall was filled with applause. It wasn't just for Barron or for Dr. Whitman. It was for the courage to engage in meaningful dialogue, for the willingness to challenge assumptions, and for the reminder that even in disagreement, there could be respect. As the applause died down, Dr. Whitman stepped back from the podium, his shoulders slightly slumped. "I think that's enough for today," he said, his voice tinged with humility. "Thank you all for your attention, and thank you, Mr. Trump, for reminding me that even the most seasoned minds can still learn something new." With that, the lecture came to an end. Students began gathering their belongings, their conversations buzzing with excitement and curiosity. Many of them glanced at Barron as they left, their expressions a mixture of admiration and newfound respect. Barron returned to his seat, where Professor Thompson approached him with a warm smile. "Well done, young man," he said, clapping Barron on the shoulder. "You handled yourself with remarkable poise. I think you've given Dr. Whitman and all of us something to think about." "Thank you, Professor," Barron replied, his voice modest. "I just wanted to share my perspective. I didn't expect it to resonate so much." Professor Thompson chuckled. "Sometimes the quietest voices have the greatest impact. Keep that in mind as you continue your journey." As Barron packed up his notebook, a few students approached him hesitantly. "That was incredible," one of them said, a young woman with wide eyes. "I've never seen anyone stand up to Dr. Whitman like that." "Thank you," Barron said, offering a polite smile. "I wasn't trying to stand up to him. I just wanted to have an honest conversation." "Well, you did more than that," another student chimed in. "You made us all think. I've never really considered how faith and reason could work together before." Barron nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "That's all I hoped for," he said, "to get people thinking." As the students filed out of the lecture hall, Dr. Whitman remained at the podium, staring down at his notes. His once neat handwriting now seemed like a jumble of meaningless scribbles. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to dismantle arguments and assert his intellectual dominance. But today, he had been reminded of something he had long forgotten: the value of humility. "Professor Whitman," a voice said, breaking his reverie. He looked up to see Barron standing before him, his expression earnest. "Yes, Mr. Trump," the professor replied, his tone softer than before. "I just wanted to thank you," Barron said. "Not just for the discussion, but for the work you've done in your field. Your research has inspired a lot of people, including me." Dr. Whitman blinked, taken aback. "You've read my work?" "Of course," Barron said with a small smile. "I may not agree with all of your conclusions, but I respect the effort and dedication you've put into your studies. It's clear that you care deeply about the pursuit of knowledge." The professor's lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment he simply stared at the young man before him, his mind racing. Finally he managed a nod. "Thank you, Mr. Trump. That means more than you know." Barron extended a hand, and after a brief hesitation, Dr. Whitman shook it. It was a gesture of mutual respect, a bridge between two minds that had once seemed worlds apart. As Barron turned to leave, Dr. Whitman called after him. "Mr. Trump." Barron paused, glancing back. "Yes, Professor." The older man hesitated, then said, "Don't lose that curiosity of yours. It's a rare gift." Barron smiled. "I won't. Thank you, Professor." With that, he walked out of the lecture hall, the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow on his path. Outside, the world seemed a little brighter, a little more hopeful. And as he joined the crowd of students heading to their next session, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. He had stood up for what he believed in, not with anger or arrogance, but with humility and conviction. And in doing so, he had reminded everyone, himself included, that faith and reason were not enemies, but allies in the search for truth. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who values thoughtful debate. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from patriots across America. And remember, in a world full of noise, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen. God bless you, and God bless America.